Hello. Okay, I am going to talk to you guys today a little bit about histamine. I feel like it's a really common, at least topic that we get a lot of questions about, and even that a lot of you guys are maybe struggling with, and just want to understand it a little bit more, and maybe some like beginning steps on how we would handle histamine, how we've handled it previously with our clients, so on and so forth. So I'm going to jump into it a little bit. I think I could be really long-winded about this topic. There's a lot here, and there's a lot of nuance, as with everything with health. But I'm going to try my best to give like a basic overview and then dive into some of the specifics of how we would approach a histamine issue. And then if we have questions, I can dive into those a little bit too. So, okay, but very first off, generally speaking, we have to understand what these things are. What is a histamine? To help you understand how they're actually showing up in the body. So, and in your particular symptoms, so we can actually deal with it. So what is a histamine? So basically, a histamine, it's a protein. It's in every single tissue in the body. So it's made by mast cells, basophils, platelets, some neurons, and other cells. So it's in every single tissue of the body. It's stored inside the cell as little granules, and then released on a situation basis when stimulation happens as needed. So it's most known for its role in our immune system and basically helping us react to allergens. Allergens being environmental allergens, but they could also be anything that our body is flagging as an allergen or foreign or foe. The thing is about histamines, and I think a lot of people don't fully understand this because they're always spoken about in a very negative light, is that they're not all bad. They're actually a good thing. We actually need this response to be healthy and working optimally. And they actually help and assist us in healing, and they help assist us to environmental dangers, like an allergy. Like if you actually had a true allergy, you would really want histamine to be working appropriately to alert you like, hey, this is not a good thing. So it triggers that pro-inflammatory response, or that mediator that kick off the immune system and that whole reaction that happens. So it's a real alarm. It's like the basis of our alarm system. So it is really good. We need that. It's just like cortisol always getting a bad rep, right? But like in reality, stress hormones to a certain point, cortisol to a certain point, are really, really good, healthy things, and a healthy reaction. We need that. And we also want that with histamine. The cool thing about histamine too is it's also responsible for helping us make stomach acid. It's helping us with muscle contractions, and even in our body's response to stress, histamine plays a role. So lots of good things about histamine too. It's not all bad. Now, if you remember at the beginning, I said histamine, it's in every single tissue in the body. This is why it gets really messy when we start to dive into symptoms of intolerance or buildup. So essentially, when we have a histamine intolerance or histamine buildup, is too much histamine in the body that our body can't process out in a really healthy way. And we get this reactivity and these histamine reactions. And because histamines are present in all of the cells and all the tissues, it can get really complicated when we're looking at symptoms. Is it histamine? Is it something else? It can be somebody over here can have totally different histamine related symptoms than you do. So it can get tricky to determine if a histamine overload is actually the problem. But here are some examples of just some symptoms that you could be experiencing if you were having a histamine overload, buildup, something of that nature. So abdominal pain and cramping, heart palpitations, brain fog, difficulty breathing. That one's pretty common when we think of like an allergic reaction that we have, like feels like, our throat's closing up, if you will. Diarrhea, constipation, period pain is another one that's actually pretty common when we think about histamine and histamine overload, because of the way that histamine sets off that pro-inflammatory reaction in the body. We can actually see a lot more instances of period pain, or if you're really struggling with painful periods, that could be an indication that you may want to look towards histamine overload. Especially if you have some of the other symptoms that I'm listing off now. Flushing, headaches, migraines, low blood pressure, and insomnia is another big one that we see with histamine overload. And those aren't all of them by any means. It's not an extensive list, but those are the most common that we see with histamine overload. And then especially like right after you eat, a lot of histamine is happening as a result of food reactivity, which I'm going to talk about why in a little bit. Sorry, we also have like your typical histamine reactions then, like your itchiness, your congestion, your like maybe puffy eyes, hives, that type, squeezing, those types of symptoms too, obviously, like when we think about a typical allergic reaction. So what's happening when histamine is actually released? So histamine is released from those mast cells in response to an antibody called immunoglobulin E. So for short, we call it IgGE. So this particular antibody is it's secreted in response to an invading pathogen, so like a virus, a bacteria, an allergenic substance in like a food or pollen in the air. But it can also be, histamine can also be a response or released in response to an injury or a cut. So you think about anything that kind of triggers that inflammatory response, that's going to have histamine as a part of that process. So it can also be released due to chemicals, medications, so on and so forth. And when it is released, histamine goes down two different pathways, or it can go down two different pathways in order to break down and then be escorted out of the body. So either pathway one, which is it's broken down by the DAO enzyme. So that enzyme breaks down histamine in the body, in the gut from food. So that's number one. And that's probably the most common. Number two, second pathway is, it's called HNMT. And that breaks down histamine using methylation. So you can see too why, like when we're talking about genetic mutations or people that have issues methylating, because of a genetic variation or genetic mutation, they may also have more trouble with histamine and histamine overload if they're not able to utilize that second pathway efficiently. Most common reason we see is usually around the DAO pathway, but there are two different ones. So how do we get this intolerance basically? So when histamine fails to break down, there can be a couple of different reasons, and there's usually, and I'll say this, with histamine intolerance, there's usually not just one straightforward reason why histamine isn't breaking down in the body. There's usually multiple reasons. As with everything, there's usually more than one root cause of an issue. And I'll talk about those different causes, but usually it's a combination of multiple reasons why this breakdown isn't happening. So a lot of the times, and we see this quite often, when practitioners approach a histamine issue, they usually treat it as if there's only one cause. So they remove food. They only focus on the gut. That's when we see a lot. Because it's a part of the immune system and an immune reaction, immune response, a lot of practitioners go just for the gut. So it is really important that we don't treat histamine as just looking at one cause. And then also histamine can attach to a lot of different receptors in the body. So histamine can bind to H1, H2, H3, and H4 receptors that are located all over the body. This is why, like I was talking about earlier, there's such a varied list of symptoms. So it can show up as headaches one day because of the receptor it's attached to, and then congestion and GI symptoms the next day, which makes this a really fun one to try to diagnose and then also get the help you actually need on fixing the cause behind the histamine issue. So when you think about it, like where it can bind, you have, let's say it binds to an H1, H2 receptor, you would see things on the skin like itching, hives, things of that nature. You can also see things more like on the anaphylaxis, low or high blood pressure, vertigo, arrhythmia. Those are all H1, H2 receptors. But you can also get into like H3 receptors, which is the CNS, the central nervous system, where you can see more like headaches, nausea after eating. We see that one's actually really common. And that can be a real sign of a histamine overload or histamine intolerance. But also, if we're talking about the central nervous system, let's talk more about like panic, anxiety, depression. Those can also be a histamine intolerance or histamine buildup as well. So also things like learning, memory, focus, body temperature, that's controlled by the central nervous system. So again, can bind anywhere, and it can change where it binds daily, weekly. So it does make it a little bit tricky. So if you're experiencing symptoms of a histamine intolerance and you're feeling like you're reacting to everything, you most likely have that buildup. And one really important thing to remember is that when you are dealing with a histamine issue, it is a stress response in the body. So it is that inflammatory response, that inflammation that's happening wherever it is happening in the body, is your body in a stressed state. So while it's tempting to just want to focus on fixing the histamine issue alone, we can't ignore the fact that stress, and if you are in a particular season of life, for example, or you have lifestyle behaviors, or a dysregulated nervous system in general, you can't replenish, your body can't replenish or have a healthy reaction or process those histamines well if the body continues to stay in a stressed out state. So it's important to keep that in mind. Again, I'm going to kind of walk through the root of why histamine issues happen, because there is more than one cause, but know that your body can't heal if it's in that stressed out state. Okay, so main reasons, and there are typically 4 causes that we see of histamine issues. So what's at the root of the histamine issues? First one, big one, nutrient deficiency and imbalances. So when you have low levels of things like copper, vitamin A, vitamin B6, vitamin C, they can lead to a histamine buildup along with excess levels of iron in the body. Iron is really important for managing and controlling that DAO enzyme, which is one of the main pathways to get rid of that histamine that is released in any sort of situation. So important number 1 root cause is looking at your mineral deficiencies, looking at your intake, looking at the reason why those minerals in particular are depleted. So you can think about, for example, is it a food preference thing, or did you just get off breastfeeding a baby, which we typically see a lot of vitamin A deficiency in, which definitely impacts copper and iron. So there's different reasons why you can have certain mineral deficiencies that could be lending a hand to this histamine overload issue. So that's one cause for sure. And like I said, usually it's not just one thing. So there's usually a combo going on here. Second cause that we usually see for histamine root cause issue is gut issues. So things like overgrowth, small intestine, bacterial overgrowth, so SIBO, pathogens, parasites, and just general immune system dysfunction. So this is when you're really looking at the gut, because 70% of the immune system is housed in the gut, and the immune system is our first line of defense when we're talking about pathogens, bacteria, viruses, things that come into our body. They set off that inflammatory response, which includes histamines. So a lot of practitioners and a lot of people will focus just on the gut, but it is one important piece of the puzzle, but you can't ignore the rest of it. So again, gut, super important piece of the puzzle. And usually when we're dealing with someone that has a histamine issue, we do want to do some gut testing and really get a picture of what is going on in the gut. But again, it's one piece. Another root cause is hormones like estrogen. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more detail. But estrogen and histamine are on a really fun feedback loop system. So when we have excess estrogen, we also tend to get excess histamine or histamine overload in the body. And I'll talk about that and why that happens in a second. The fourth root cause then typically is things like Lasik, birth control, antihistamines, etc. can also contribute to histamine buildup, typically because they're depleting, kind of going back to the first one, depleting those minerals and nutrients. So medication, while it's separate, I probably put it underneath that root cause of nutrient deficiencies and imbalances. So those are the main reasons that we really see, or reasons behind histamine overload. So just kind of, I'll break down those root causes a little bit in a little bit more detail. So again, starting with nutrient deficiencies, things like copper, we need it in order to break down the histamine. Bioavailable copper, so when copper is bioavailable in the body, meaning we can actually utilize it. The thing is with copper is we can get copper from the food that we eat, but we need other minerals to work with copper synergistically in order to be able to utilize it in the body. If copper cannot be utilized in the body, it stores. And it becomes biounavailable for us to use. It can also then create its own issues because it does tend to store in the liver and the brain, creating issues with your detoxification pathways. It can create symptoms with neurological function, things of that nature. So we need bioavailable copper. We need vitamin A to activate copper, to utilize copper in the body. And this is what activates that DAO system enzyme. So without copper, without vitamin A, we won't activate or fully activate that DAO enzyme and be able to process that histamine through that pathway. And iron is also impacted because we need copper and vitamin A in order for the iron recycling system to work appropriately. So again, copper being a big one. And if you are somebody that, and you might be wondering if you have a copper deficiency, this is one of the reasons why we do and love the HTMA test, because we can really gain insights into these things, especially revolving mineral and nutrient depletion. But if you do have a copper depletion, and you could really just look at what food are you eating, you could start there. There's also other reasons behind copper depletion. So if you're taking a lot of ascorbic acid or vitamin C supplementation, that can really drive down copper. You want to focus on whole food vitamin C, which is really synergistic with copper and amazing. But the ascorbic acid, that is most synthetic vitamin C supplements, really does drive down copper. The other things that can drive down copper as far as supplements is vitamin D. And a lot of people are supplementing excessively with vitamin D and not realizing how it's impacting and really playing a role in depleting and throwing off the balance of other minerals in the body. So that's another big one. Zinc and copper are antagonistic to one another. So if you're taking a zinc supplement, especially a high dose zinc supplement, so thinking over 30 milligrams, something in that nature, and it's not just like a short amount of time, but you've been doing it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, that can really drive down your copper. And then iron supplements also act antagonistically against your copper. So some things to keep in mind there. The other things too is B6 also are cofactors for, and whole food vitamin C cofactors for DAO. Another one that we see, a really common nutrient deficiency that we see, especially in today's day and age because of the way, it's iodine by the way, but because of the way we process salt, they've taken a lot of iodine out of our salt, and not a lot of people are eating a whole bunch of iodine-rich foods unless you live in a very ocean-centered place. So a lot of iodine is found in, you can think about it, sea salt, seawater animals, and plants. So kelp, seaweed, shellfish, fish. There is iodine in cheese as well, a random one that snuck in there. But a lot of people tend to be deficient in iodine now because we aren't putting it in our food, and in our salt. So it is a super common deficiency. But iodine actually helps decrease histamine production. So iodine inhibits the conversion of histidine, the amino acid, to histamine. So it kind of works as a feedback mechanism. So when iodine levels are sufficient, it helps keep histamine in check. And when we become deficient, we can see a lot of excess of histamine. Iodine is also super important for thyroid and hormone balance. So going back to the other root cause of histamine being an estrogen issue, typically when we have and see excess estrogen in our clients, a lot of the times we can trace it back to a slowdown in metabolic function, which is really a slow thyroid function. And iodine, really important mineral in order to make enough thyroid hormone for a healthy metabolism and healthy hormones. So excess estrogen, we need a thyroid that's working optimally in order to help boost that metabolic function and process and detoxify estrogen out of the body. So 2 reasons why iodine, directly how it impacts histamine, and then also how it impacts our thyroid. And if you're like, how do I get more iodine? Yes, eat more seafood, get some kelp, get some seaweed, but there's also a really cool Marine Coast. It's a company, you can buy their sea veg salt or kelp salt on Amazon, or in like Whole Foods. And that's another fun, just easy way. You use it just like salt. It tastes just like salt. You salt your food with it. And that can be a good way to just get some more iodine into your diet. Okay. So now, and there's some other things too, but we're just going to pop on down to gut health. For, like I said, I could talk about this for a long, long time. When I started this videos, there's a lot of detail here. So just kind of popping back down into gut health and histamines. So like I said before, root cause, bacterial overgrowth, pathogens, parasites, low beneficial bacteria, depleted immune system. So usually we see depleted immune system when we have depleted adrenal function. So if you're somebody that's been in a state of stress, chronic stress for a really long time, we do end up seeing like low functioning adrenals, which then directly impacts our immune system and our ability for our immune system to respond appropriately and efficiently. And so we can see a depleted immune system being a reason for histamine overload as well. They all have an impact on histamine production and the ability to break that down. So certain bacteria in the gut may cause mast cells to release histamine, while other bacteria can actually produce histamine. So things like, and if you are someone who's ever done a gut test or you do gut testing in the future, this is something to keep in mind. So typically when we test our clients for gut testing, we do look at bacteria, we look at their microbiome, we also test for pathogens, parasites, all of those good things. Some overgrowth of bacteria species like Morganella and Calbiciella, I'm mispronouncing those wrong probably. They can both lead, if you have an overgrowth of either of those pathogens, we tend to see more histamine production and more histamine intolerance symptoms. So that's one that we definitely want to look out, or two that we want to look out for. H. pylori infections can also, we see those, that's a pathogenic bacteria in the gut. They can actually cause mast cells to degranulate, which leads to more histamine being released into the system. So that's one we want to look for and test for. Also, parasites can increase the IgE immunoglobulin, which can lead to heightened immune response, and you can have a really hard time turning that off once it's on. So parasites can definitely contribute to that. And a GI map, like a stool test, like a proper one, not one you buy off of like Everlywell or something like that, but one that can be run by a practitioner that can evaluate all these different things, can be really helpful, especially if you're dealing with histamine, to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on as one of the pieces of the puzzle. And then with the immune system, one of the most common reasons that we see high histamine production in the gut is because of that, like I said before, that low functioning immune system, which typically shows up as low secretory IgA on a stool test. So when you have low levels of SIG-A, which is typically what we call it, you end up with higher levels of IgE being expressed, because IgA, that secretory IgA, is our first line of defense. It's in all the mucus in our body. First line of defense against any bad guys coming into our system. If that gets depleted, lowered, usually due to chronic stress and adrenal dysfunction, we lose that first line of defense. So basically what ends up happening is the body then makes and sends out more of the immunoglobulin IgE when there's not enough. And IgE starts flagging everything. Starts flagging everything as foe. We end up really super reactive to lots of things. It's a lot of the times why people come to us with histamine problems. Are like, I'm reacting to everything. I can't even eat food. I can't even, some cases, we've had one in particular where they're like, I can't even drink water without it hurting. So it can get really extreme. But that is usually and typically one of the causes. Dysbiosis as well. So either having low commensal bacteria, we want a microbiome that's really diverse. And if we have dysbiosis, so if there's an imbalance of that beneficial and non-beneficial bacteria, that will bring down our Treg system. So the T cells it's a population that suppress the immune response. So the whole point of this immune system is to regulate that immune response. And if you're having, for example, like an allergic response to things that aren't harming you, like food particles, then this regulation system has clearly been impacted, and usually due to dysbiosis. So how can you support that immune system gut? Like I said, always recommend testing, because there can be pathogens, overgrowth, parasites present, that you want to work with someone on the best course of action of how to eradicate those, rebuild the gut. So that's definitely one. Gut testing can help you identify those things. There's also some other products that we've found to be helpful. Again, I caution, because I don't, I think it's really important to work with someone who understands your health history and what's going on. But things to consider, things like colostrum, and there's Mega IgG 200, which is a supplement that we found that helps, that regulate those immunoglobulins, can be helpful. Also helpful probiotics. Again, want to look at your own, test your own gut, figure out what works best for you. But when you're looking for probiotics, like I said, there's bacteria that can actually make histamine issues worse. So you don't want to go out and just get a whatever broad spectrum probiotic. You do want to be more take more consideration into the probiotics that you use. I know like Seeking Health has a really great histamine friendly probiotic, but you definitely want to be cautious about your probiotic use if you're having histamine issues. So keep that in mind. But those are all good ways to support the immune system. Okay, last core root issue that we typically see with histamine is hormones. So estrogen specifically. So estrogen is tied to histamine levels in the body. They both have an impact on one another. So whenever we see histamine, like I said, we evaluate the gut, we evaluate nutrient deficiencies, we'll evaluate health history, medication, stress, all of those things. The other thing is we want to evaluate if hormones are playing a role. But with hormones are reactive. Hormones are not a root cause in and of themselves. So if you have excess estrogen, there's always a question beyond that as to why. Always want to ask that why. When you have hormone issues of any kind, hormones are not your why. Hormones are just giving you excess information, which is important to gather and have, but they are not the why. So you always want to ask one step further, why? Go further upstream and figure out the why. So however, excess estrogen stimulates mast cells to release histamine, and it downregulates the DAO system that helps break down and exit histamine from the body. So at the same time, it's kind of like I said, it's this fun feedback system. At the same time, histamine stimulates the ovaries to make more estrogen. So the net result of all of this can be this lovely vicious cycle of high estrogen. We get more histamine because we're downregulating the DAO enzyme, which then leads to more estrogen because we stimulate the ovaries, which then keeps us in this fun little loop. This is also why, if you have histamine issues, pay really close attention to your cycle and see if estrogen may be playing a role. Because like I said, nutrient deficiencies, gut, estrogen, want to look at all of them. You may experience all three in having and playing a role in your histamine, and maybe 1, 2, or so on and so forth. But if you're paying attention to your cycle, you can figure out pretty quickly if excess estrogen is part of the issue. So typically, if it is, we'll see more reactivity around ovulation. So ovulation is time in your cycle when estrogen is at its highest point. So it makes sense that you would see more. Other thing is histamine symptoms leading up to your period. There is another small estrogen peak right before your period. So if that 5 days before your period, you're getting a little histamine or more reactions to more things, that can be another indication. And then typically in your follicular phase, so right after your period, you enter into your follicular phase. So if you have excess estrogen during that follicular phase, where estrogen should be at its lowest point in your menstrual phase, and then during your follicular phase, you should start to get an uptake in estrogen and a slow rise of estrogen. If there's excess in that follicular phase, you could potentially be more reactive as well. But we also find that when we're working with women that on excess estrogen, sometimes when metabolism speeds up, when we're creating more progesterone in order to offset that high level of estrogen, so as metabolism speeds and progesterone levels increase, you can experience what we call estrogen dumping. Excess estrogen typically hides and lives in the tissues. And so when we get that metabolic speed up and more progesterone, our estrogen leaves the tissues. And sometimes it can be in a large amount. And we can experience something that we call estrogen dumping. And usually this leads to more symptoms in your follicular phase. which is not the most fun, and sometimes it can feel like a setback, because you'll start to feel better, and then all of a sudden you're getting more reactivity where you were like, I thought I was better, and things were on the up and up. It's actually a really good thing. Estrogen dumping is fairly common on the healing journey. And it's necessary. We want to get that estrogen out, removed from the body so you don't have to deal with it anymore. Usually it takes a couple of cycles, and then we see major improvements afterwards. So how you can support this estrogen-histamine relationship, you want to support ovulation and progesterone. So this is the stress conversation again. We really want to become more resilient to stress. So this is coming back to nutrient density. Are you eating enough? How is your blood sugar? All of these things that we have under our own control as far as stressors on the body, super important to manage and become really resilient in that way. There's a lot of external stressors that we can't control, but if we're working on nutrient density, if we're working on mineral balance, if our body has the resources and energy through enough calories and enough protein and all of those things, we will become more resilient to external stressors that we don't have a whole lot of control over. So that's really important. We also see a lot of benefit to introducing a vitamin E supplement, because that can help degranulate mast cells. And then fiber-rich foods. So if you think that estrogen is an issue, excess estrogen is an issue, focus on fiber-rich foods. Things like, and there's particular fiber-rich foods that are really great at removing excess estrogen. So raw carrots, cooked greens, beans, if you're not sensitive to beans, can be really helpful in removing estrogen. And then keep in mind, hormones are usually the last thing to change on your journey. So you have to address what's causing the high estrogen in the first place, which is usually mineral deficiencies, gut issues, history of birth control. Maybe you have a hormonal IUD, maybe you have excess iron. There's lots of reasons why. And you probably want to work with someone to figure out what those whys are, work on those things, and then know that you're going to see improvements. Typically down the road, it usually takes a few cycles that you will see that improvement. Okay. Now, if anyone has any questions, throw them up. I'm just going to throw out some other kind of helpful things potentially with histamine symptoms that could help. So let's say you're on this journey now and you're like, great, I'm going to dive into nutrient mineral deficiencies. I'm going to dive into my gut. I'm going to dive into my why behind my excess estrogen and like get this stuff under control and back in balance, which is great. But we all know this stuff takes time. Like I said, it can take 2, 3, 4, 6, sometimes 8 cycles to start to really see movement. So in the meantime, there can be things on the journey that can help relieve symptoms while you're working on the underlying issues. So I am not, and if you've been following me and listening to me talk for a while, I am not usually a proponent of restricting foods or removing foods from your diet. But in certain cases, your body may be flagging foods that are low in histamine, flagging foods that are high in histamine. And it could be a nice way to give your body a break, your immune system a break, to just remove those foods temporarily. But keep in mind too, that if you do have a depleted immune system, if your IgE levels are really high, if you're having trouble with the DA out enzyme, like your body may also be reacting to foods that are low in histamine. So because of that IgE. So food removal isn't always the answer, but in some cases, some of the really heavy hitters of high histamine foods can be a good relief. Things like citrus, fermented foods, alcohol. Those are the big ones. And then you also, again, HTMA testing, super great for this, but prioritizing the foods that you're deficient in, that can be impacting this whole process. So look at your HTMA, look at your health history, and then if there are any gut health concerns, we want to address that with good gut testing, work with someone who can help to rebalance the gut microbiome. The other thing is you can utilize some supplements that could be helpful as well. So quercetin is, we found, a really great supplement to like mitigate symptoms, especially environmental allergies, or you just feel like you're really super reactive to things. Quercetin, high dose quercetin can be really helpful, and it's also really healing for the gut. You could in theory try a DAO enzyme if you suspect that pathway is really an issue. You would need to do this for a minute to see, like a month or two, to actually notice if it was having any impact or making a difference. But it is something that you could try. Nettles, so stinging nettles are usually really good at symptom relief. They are great for like almost as a natural antihistamine. So stinging nettles, there's teas, tinctures. I like a tea. I think it's great. If you're concerned with estrogen, you could introduce a vitamin E. And then, and go from there. I will say too, one thing that's extremely helpful is if you're struggling with a lot of food reactivity in relationship to histamines, please focus on your digestion, because if IgE is an issue, so if your secretory IgA is low on your gut test and IgE is an issue, if you do not break down your food properly, there are going to be bigger proteins. Those proteins are going to escape those tight gut junctions and create even more inflammation, more reactivity, send off more signals of the IgE immune response. So focus on your digestion. Some basic digestion things that can be so helpful. Sit down and eat your food. One of the most common things that I see from women especially is y'all are eating standing up on the go. You feed everyone else and then you're running around trying to feed yourself, or literally standing and eating. Sit down, eat your food, eat without distractions, chew your food, slow down at meal times. Your body cannot digest and break down your food if you are in a stressed out state. And stressed out state meaning you could have just come from running around doing an activity and you run in your house and you're grabbing something to eat quick. That's a stressed out state. Take a few breaths, calm down, and literally can be as simple as taking a few deep breaths, calm down, sit down, chew your food, eat it, get into that rest and digest, break down your food appropriately. You need that in order to digest anything that you eat. Second thing that can be really helpful though is introducing a digestive bitters or apple cider vinegar in order to help with just producing and stimulating those digestive juices in order to break down fully your food. So that is also very, very helpful. And I recommend that if there's any digestive concerns whatsoever, really look and focus on your digestion and see what's going on there. So I hope that was helpful. I know it was like an hour of me chatting about histamine, so it's a lot of information, and honestly, you could get into the weeds with this one quite a bit. But yeah, look for the root cause. Look at those 3 different things: nutrient deficiencies, gut, hormones. Support those things. Know that it takes some time if you're doing this, especially from a functional medicine standpoint. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys. So we will talk soon.